6 European countries whose debt exceeds their GDP. 6. Belgium, 599.6 billion euros in debt. Debt to GDP ratio, 107.4%. Belgium has been hit hard by the energy crisis. The debt ratio in 2023 exceeded all forecasts. Belgium's public finances deteriorated during the pandemic. The fiscal deficit reached 9% of GDP in 2020. Compare it to the 5 years prior, when it averaged just 1.7% of GDP. In September 2023, Belgium sold a record number of retail bonds. 21.9 billion euros were sold to households. It was Europe's biggest ever debt offering. The government intends this to serve as a message to the banks. Belgium expects them to raise saving rates. More than 600,000 people poured into the one-year notes. Basically, Belgium is trying to tap into private savings accounts. 5. France, 3.01 trillion euros in debt. Debt to GDP ratio, 112.4%. France reached its first trillion in debt in 2003. In the 20 years since, the debt has tripled. France's debt is obviously not sustainable. The country's borrowing surged massively during the pandemic. Then France found itself in a cost of living crisis. The growing debt mountain caused a Fitch credit downgrade. Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire vowed to intervene. He promises to work toward debt reduction in 2024, but it would take drastic public spending cuts. Le Maire has announced at least 10 billion euros of savings. 4. Spain, 1.53 trillion euros in debt. Debt to GDP ratio, 112.8%. Spain's debt ratio actually fell quite steeply. In 2022, the decrease was more than 5 percentage points, but it had skyrocketed by more than 20% during the pandemic. This was largely due to increased public spending. The Spanish economy also contracted along with the others, but the government's spending cuts have worked. Spain's GDP showed a strong 5.5% growth in 2022. Its post-pandemic recovery is one of the most remarkable. 3. Portugal, 279.3 billion euros in debt. Debt to GDP ratio, 113.8%. Portugal's debt owes to government actions. Back in 2008, the financial crisis hit the Portuguese banking sector hard. The government bailed them out. In turn, it led to a public debt crisis. This was solved with the help of IMF and EU loans. Portugal is actually better off than it was during COVID. In 2020, Portugal's debt to GDP ratio stood at 137.2%. Finance Minister Fernando Medina has pledged to cut it further. The government is targeting a budget deficit of 0.4% of GDP. It was the same in 2022, almost negligible compared to some others. Portugal expects to finish 2023 with a debt ratio of 107.5%. 2. Italy, 2.79 trillion euros in debt. Debt to GDP ratio, 143.5%. Italy has simply been borrowing too much. It failed to meet policy conditions set by the European Commission. This has delayed some tranches. In October, Italy had to hike its debt issuance estimates. It's the only major Eurozone country to do so. Germany and Portugal, for instance, have reduced their borrowing needs, but Italy has raised them to 333 billion euros, 20 billion euros over the forecast. 1. Greece, 355.2 billion euros in debt. Debt to GDP ratio, 168.3%. Like Portugal's, Greece's problems can be traced back to 2008. Following the financial crisis, Greece defaulted on its sovereign debt. Austerity measures led to further impoverishment. This led to a loss of confidence in the Greek economy. 2 bailouts led to more austerity measures. There were 12 different tax hikes and spending cuts. This caused unrest, and a third bailout was rejected by a referendum. Greece failed to repay the IMF on time. The country has been slowly recovering since 2020. In 2023, It was awarded an investment grade status by Scope. It's the first time in 12 years that this has happened.